What if I told you that a table tennis game once thawed the Cold War? Or that 700,000 perfectly good cars were deliberately destroyed to save the economy? History loves its loud moments, the wars, the speeches, the dramatic headlines. But some of the most consequential changes in American history happened quietly, almost accidentally, while everyone was looking somewhere else. A strike that nobody remembers created public sector unions. A poem that aired once reshaped every political campaign after it. A compromise over counting enslaved people as fractions of humans poisoned democracy for generations. Over the next couple hours, we're going to explore 100 little-known moments in history that quietly changed America. Not the famous stuff, the subtle pivots, the forgotten bills, the backroom deals that redirected everything. Before we start, if you enjoy falling asleep to history's weird secrets, hit subscribe. Your algorithm will thank you, and you'll never run out of bedtime content. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's talk about the moments that changed everything while pretending to change nothing. Starting with postal workers who forced a president to deploy the National Guard to sort mail, the Great Postal Strike. So here's the thing about 1970, while everyone was busy worrying about Vietnam and bell-bottoms, something genuinely wild happened that nobody talks about anymore. The postal workers just stopped. Like, the entire mail system, 200,000 letter carriers decided they'd had enough of wages, so low they qualified for food stamps, and they walked off the job. Nixon, in a move that sounds like something from a fever dream, actually deployed the National Guard to sort mail. Picture 20-year-old soldiers in fatigues trying to figure out zip codes. It was chaos. But here's where it gets interesting. This strike became the first major federal union victory, and it birthed the entire concept of modern public sector collective bargaining. The government realized you can't just pay people in patriotic speeches and expectations. They needed actual money. Wild concept, right? And just when you think Nixon's relationship with unexpected diplomatic solutions couldn't get weirder, ping-pong diplomacy. 1971 brought us perhaps the most accidentally brilliant foreign policy move in American history, the U.S. And China hadn't spoken in decades, like properly not speaking, Cold War style silent treatment, and then some American ping-pong players got invited to Beijing, just casually. And somehow, this stupid little paddle game became the crack in the ice that nobody saw coming. The Chinese player Zhuang Zedong struck up a conversation with American Glenn Cowan on a team bus, gave him a silk tapestry, and suddenly international relations experts were frantically taking notes. Nixon, who was many things but never slow on the uptake, saw the opportunity and ran with it. By 1972, he was in China, shaking hands with Mao, fundamentally reshaping global politics. All because someone was decent at ping-pong. The whole thing feels like it was written by someone who'd given up on reality. But speaking of media moments that changed everything, the Daisy Girl ad. September 1964 gave us 60 seconds of television that rewired American political advertising forever. You've probably never seen it, the ad only aired once, during Monday night at the movies on NBC. But you've definitely felt its impact. A little girl counts petals on a daisy, then a countdown, then a nuclear explosion reflected in her eye. LBJ's campaign never even mentioned Barry Goldwater by name, but everyone knew exactly what it meant. Vote for this guy and your kids get vaporized. The polls shifted 10 points overnight. 10 points. From one commercial. Goldwater's campaign never recovered, and every negative political ad since then owes something to this moment. It was manipulative. It was terrifying, and it worked so well they never needed to run it again. The backlash was immediate, but the damage, or the victory, depending on your perspective, was already done. Though Nixon would eventually have his own televised crisis moment. Saturday Night Massacre. October 1973. The night Watergate went from political scandal to constitutional crisis, live on everyone's television. Nixon ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, who was getting way too close to the truth. Richardson refused and resigned. Nixon then ordered Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to do it. Finally, Solicitor General Robert Bork agreed to fire Cox, and the whole mess became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. The public reaction was thermonuclear. Congressional offices were flooded with telegrams, actual telegrams, because 1973 demanding impeachment. The incident proved that even presidential power has limits when enough people are watching and caring. It forced the appointment of a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, and basically accelerated Nixon's downfall. Sometimes the cover-up really is worse than the crime. But this wasn't the first time a president tried to reshape institutions to suit his needs. Court-packing threat, 1937 brought us one of FDR's most controversial, not quite actions. The Supreme Court kept striking down New Deal legislation like aggressively striking it down, and Roosevelt got creative. He proposed adding up to 6 new justices to the court, 1 for every sitting justice over 70. The Judicial Procedures Reform Bill, it was called. Very official sounding. Everyone immediately called it court packing, because that's exactly what it was. The plan never actually passed. But here's the twist. It worked anyway. Justice Owen Roberts mysteriously started voting to uphold New Deal laws, a switch so convenient it got nicknamed the switch in time that saved 9. Social Security survived. Labor protection survived. The New Deal survived. FDR lost the battle, but won the war without firing a shot, just by threatening institutional change. The court got the message: evolve or be evolved. Though sometimes the message the public sends is even more direct and devastating. The banking holiday that reset American trust, March 1933. America's financial system was in free fall. Banks across the country were collapsing under the weight of panic withdrawals. People lined up outside shuttered buildings, hoping to retrieve savings that no longer existed. The system wasn't just unstable, it was frozen by fear. Confidence, once lost, is hard to rebuild. So Franklin Roosevelt did something unprecedented. 2 days after taking office, he declared a nationwide banking holiday. Every bank in the United States closed at the same time. No withdrawals, no transfers. For 4 days, the country waited. Behind the scenes, federal examiners inspected banks one by one. Institutions that could prove solvency were allowed to reopen. Those that couldn't stayed closed. When the doors finally reopened, something remarkable happened. People didn't rush to withdraw their money. They deposited it. Trust had been reset. The banking holiday didn't fix the Great Depression, but it stabilized the financial system at the exact moment it could have collapsed completely. It laid the groundwork for federal deposit insurance, modern banking regulation, and the idea that sometimes the government's most powerful tool isn't action, it's pause. Sometimes stopping everything, briefly and deliberately, changes the direction of history more than any sweeping reform. And while the government was learning how to manage panic at home, it was also redefining how it managed borders. Alien Registration Act. 1940 brought us the Smith Act. Officially, the Alien Registration Act, which sounds boring until you realize it quietly built the skeleton of modern immigration surveillance. Every non-citizen in America had to register with the government and get fingerprinted. 5 million people lined up to be cataloged, filed, indexed. The official reason was national security. World War II was coming, but the framework it created never went away. Those fingerprint databases, that registration infrastructure, that lovely precedent for tracking people based on where they were born, all of it became the foundation for what eventually evolved into ICE and modern immigration enforcement systems. The act also made it illegal to advocate for overthrowing the government, which sounds reasonable until you realize how broadly that can be interpreted. Speech got criminalized, people got deported, and the machinery of modern immigration control started humming. It's fascinating how emergency measures become permanent fixtures. Speaking of immigration enforcement with unfortunate names, the quiet creation of the U.S. Border Patrol. In 1924, Congress created a new federal agency with almost no public attention, the United States Border Patrol. At the time, America's borders were surprisingly informal. Immigration enforcement existed, but it was scattered, inconsistent, and largely handled by local officials. The Border Patrol was meant to standardize oversight, not as a dramatic crackdown, but as an administrative solution to growing federal responsibilities. The timing mattered. That same year, Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1924, establishing national origin quotas that reshaped who could legally enter the country. For the first time, immigration policy was being enforced not just at ports, but along thousands of miles of land borders. The Border Patrol started small, just a few hundred officers, limited resources, and vague authority. But it represented a fundamental shift. Immigration enforcement was no longer occasional or local. It became permanent, centralized, and professionalized. Over time, the agency's mission expanded. What began as a bureaucratic response to new laws evolved into a defining institution of modern immigration policy. Quietly, without fanfare, the federal government created the framework that still shapes border enforcement today. Big changes don't always arrive with headlines or speeches. Sometimes they begin as line items in a budget, offices filled one desk at a time, doing work that no one notices until decades later, when it's impossible to imagine the system without them. Don't ask, don't tell. 1993 brought us Bill Clinton's attempt to let gay and lesbian Americans serve in the military, which turned into a compromise that satisfied absolutely nobody but accidentally changed everything anyway. Don't ask, don't tell meant you could serve as long as you stayed closeted. Don't ask about it, don't tell about it, and definitely don't get caught at a gay bar off base. It was supposed to be progressive. Instead, it discharged over 13,000 service members before it was finally repealed in 2011. But here's the weird part: by creating this bizarre middle ground, the policy actually made LGBTQ military service visible in a way it hadn't been before. It became a constant national conversation. Every discharge was a news story. Every debate highlighted the absurdity. The compromise unintentionally laid the groundwork for full acceptance by making the discrimination impossible to ignore. Sometimes the worst solutions reveal the best paths forward. And speaking of education policy attempting to thread an impossible needle, No Child Left Behind, January 2002, gave us No Child Left Behind. And if you went to school any time after that, you probably remember the tests. So many tests. Standardized tests became the entire point of education, the sun around which everything else orbited. The law was supposed to close achievement gaps by making schools accountable through testing. What it actually did was shift education from local control to federal mandates, quietly transforming American schooling in ways we're still untangling. Teachers started teaching to tests instead of teaching subjects. Schools in poor areas got punished for having poor students, which seems like missing the point entirely. The law had bipartisan support: Ted Kennedy and George W. Bush working together. Truly a different era, but the implementation revealed how good intentions plus bad metrics equals chaos. By the time Obama waived requirements for most states, the damage to education culture was already baked in. Though, at least that policy didn't involve literally destroying 700,000 cars. Cash for clunkers. Summer 2009 brought us cash for clunkers. Officially, the car allowance rebate system, which was either brilliant stimulus policy or environmental theater, depending on who you ask. The government gave people up to $4,500 to trade in old gas guzzlers for newer, more efficient vehicles. Sounds great, right? Here's the catch. They didn't just take the old cars off the road, they intentionally destroyed them. Mechanics poured liquid glass into the engines, seized them up permanently, then crushed 700,000 perfectly functional vehicles. The program boosted auto sales during the recession, genuinely helped dealerships survive, but it also removed affordable used cars from the market forever, making it harder for poor people to buy vehicles for years afterward. Plus, it skewed emissions data because suddenly all the worst polluters were gone from measurements, making improvement look better than it was. The road to economic recovery is apparently paved with crushed transmissions, though that's not the first time literature sparked massive regulatory change. Pure Food and Drug Act. 1906 gave us the Pure Food and Drug Act, and we have rats to thank for it. Well, rats in Upton Sinclair, he wrote. The Jungle, trying to expose the horrific conditions of meatpacking workers, hoping America would rise up for labor rights. Instead, everyone fixated on the part about rats getting ground into sausages. Teddy Roosevelt read it during breakfast, allegedly threw his sausage against the wall, and demanded reform. The public went wild, not about worker exploitation, mind you, but about the idea their food might contain rodent parts. Classic priorities. The resulting act created what would eventually become the FDA, fundamentally transforming how America regulates food and drugs. Sinclair later said, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." Sometimes you revolutionize public health by grossing people out rather than appealing to their conscience. It's not noble, but it works, though using protection as justification for restriction would become its own problematic pattern. Muller v. Oregon. 1908 brought us Muller v. Oregon, a Supreme Court case that's frustratingly complicated. Oregon passed a law limiting women to 10-hour workdays in factories and laundries, supposedly to protect their health and reproductive capacity. Louis Brandeis defended it with his famous Brandeis Brief, packed with sociological data about women's physical limitations. The court unanimously agreed that women needed protection from excessive labor. Progressive victory, right? Except, here's where it gets messy. This protective legislation became the legal justification for keeping women out of higher-paying jobs for decades. Can't work long hours? Can't have that management position. Need protection? Can't do dangerous but well-paid work. The case became a double-edged sword. It acknowledged that working conditions could be harmful, which was genuinely progressive, but it also enshrined the idea that women were fundamentally weaker and needed special treatment. Good intentions, terrible long-term consequences. The paternalism was real and it was restrictive, though labor restrictions would soon take an even harder turn against workers. Taft-Hartley Act, 1947, gave us the Taft-Hartley Act, and organized labor is still mad about it. Truman vetoed it, calling it a slave labor bill. His words, not mine, but Congress overrode his veto anyway. The act restricted union activities in ways that quietly defanged the labor movement for generations. It banned closed shops, allowed states to pass right-to-work laws, let employers campaign against unions, and gave the president power to order strikers back to work. Basically, it took the teeth out of collective bargaining while leaving the appearance of workers' rights intact. Union membership peaked in 1954 and has been declining ever since, and this act is a big reason why. The funny part, and by funny I mean deeply ironic, is that it passed because of anti-communist hysteria. Union leaders had to sign affidavits, swearing they weren't communists. Nothing says freedom like mandatory political loyalty oaths. The act's still on the books, still shaping labor relations, still frustrating organizers 75 years later, though at least that inequality was theoretical. Other forms were brutally explicit. G.I. Bill exclusions. 1944 gave us the G.I. Bill, one of the greatest social programs in American history, unless you were black. On paper, the benefits were race-neutral. In practice, they were anything but. Black veterans faced systematic exclusion from the home loans that built white suburban wealth. Banks redlined their neighborhoods. Thanks for watching. Banks redlined their neighborhoods. The VA approved mortgages for white vets at vastly higher rates. Universities accepting black students were underfunded and overcrowded. The job training programs often steered black vets toward menial labor. So while the G.I. Bill created the white middle class and generational wealth for millions of white families, black veterans got shut out of the very program they'd fought to defend. The wealth gap we see today, the massive difference in median family wealth between white and black Americans, traces directly back to these 1940s discriminatory lending practices. The G.I. Bill didn't create equality. It turbocharged inequality, then called it meritocracy. Sometimes the most progressive programs have the most regressive implementations. Speaking of programs with complicated legacies, Bracero program end. 1964 marked the end of the Bracero program, which had brought temporary Mexican agricultural workers to the U.S. since 1942. For 22 years, America relied on these workers called braceros, from the Spanish word for arms, to harvest crops, especially during World War II labor shortages. Then suddenly, overpressure from labor unions worried about wage competition, the program ended. 500,000 workers who'd built their lives around this seasonal migration suddenly had no legal way to work. Many kept coming anyway, now as undocumented immigrants, because the crops still needed harvesting and the farmers still wanted cheap labor. The cancellation helped spark Cesar Chavez's Great Boycott and the farm worker movement, since now there were vulnerable undocumented workers to organize and protect. The program's end didn't stop migration, it just criminalized it, creating the undocumented population that became a political flashpoint for decades. We wanted the labor. We just didn't want the humanity attached. Though at least the next immigration reform attempted a more equitable approach. Hart-Celler Act, 1965 brought the Hart-Celler Act. For decades, immigration quotas heavily favored Northern Europeans, like explicitly favored them, because the 1924 system was basically racist by design. Hart-Celler abolished the national origins quotas and replaced them with a preference system prioritizing family reunification and skilled workers. LBJ signed it at the Statue of Liberty, which was nice symbolism, and assured everyone it wouldn't really change America's demographic makeup. He was extremely wrong. Immigration from Asia exploded. Latin American immigration increased dramatically. The percentage of foreign-born Americans went from less than 5% in 1970 to over 14% today. The act quietly diversified America in ways nobody anticipated, shifted political coalitions, changed neighborhoods, altered cuisine, basically transformed the entire national character. It's one of those laws where the long-term effects were way bigger than anyone imagined. Sometimes, the most profound changes arrive wearing boring legislative clothing, though America's founding compromises had even longer shadows. 3/5 Compromise. Summer 1787. In Philadelphia, the Constitutional Convention nearly collapsed before it started, and the reason was math. Southern states wanted enslaved people counted for representation. More people meant more congressional seats, but obviously didn't want to count them as, actual citizens with rights. Northern states said, absolutely not. We're not giving you extra political power for people you're enslaving. The deadlock threatened everything. The solution was the 3/5 Compromise. Each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxation purposes. It's one of those historical moments that's so morally grotesque, it almost feels fictional. They mathematically defined human worth as a fraction. The compromise gave Southern states extra congressional seats and electoral votes based on their enslaved populations, which means slavery wasn't just protected, it was politically advantageous. The extra power helped slaveholding presidents win elections and pass pro-slavery laws for decades. The Constitution almost didn't happen without this devil's bargain. Sometimes the price of unity is soul-crushing moral compromise. Though the next major compromise would prove equally catastrophic in delaying the inevitable. Missouri Compromise. 1820 brought us the Missouri Compromise, which kicked the Civil War down the road for 30 years while everyone pretended the problem would somehow solve itself. Missouri wanted to enter the Union as a slave state, which would have upset the delicate Senate balance. Henry Clay, ever the dealmaker, crafted a solution. Missouri comes in as a slave state. Maine splits from Massachusetts and comes in as a free state. And everything north of the 36 degrees 30 parallel in the Louisiana Territory is forever free. Problem solved. Right? Except it just froze the conflict without addressing the underlying moral catastrophe. Thomas Jefferson said it scared him like a fire bell in the night, which is poetic, but didn't stop anyone from enforcing the compromise. Then in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise line, letting territories decide slavery by popular vote. That sparked Bleeding Kansas, which was basically a preview of the Civil War, complete with massacres and guerrilla warfare. You can just postpone the reckoning. And speaking of reconstructions and betrayals, Compromise of 1877. 1877 gave us one of history's most consequential backroom deals. The presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden was contested, disputed electoral votes, claims of fraud, constitutional crisis energy. Southern Democrats and Republicans made a deal. Hayes gets the presidency, and, in exchange, federal troops withdraw from the South, ending Reconstruction. Hayes took office, pulled the troops, and Reconstruction died overnight. Black Americans in the South, who'd briefly experienced political power and civil rights under federal protection, were suddenly abandoned to white supremacist violence. Jim Crow laws swept in immediately. Lynchings increased. Black voting rights evaporated through literacy tests and poll taxes. The withdrawal of federal protection basically erased 15 years of progress in exchange for settling an election. It's one of those moments where you can draw a straight line from a political compromise to decades of suffering. Though reforming government corruption would require different kinds of tragic catalysts. Pendleton Act, 1883 brought us the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, and it only took a presidential assassination to make it happen. President James Garfield was shot in 1881 by Charles Guiteau, a disappointed office seeker who'd been denied a position he thought he deserved under the spoils system. Garfield lingered for 80 days before dying, and the public was horrified. The spoils system, where presidents handed out government jobs to political supporters, regardless of qualifications, suddenly seemed less charming and more deadly. Chester Arthur, despite being a product of that very system, signed the Pendleton Act, requiring competitive exams for federal positions. Merit replaced patronage, at least in theory. The civil service was born. It didn't eliminate political appointments entirely, but it professionalized government work and made competence at least somewhat relevant to employment. Sometimes progress requires tragedy to overcome inertia, though the next major reform would take an ironic detour before finding its intended target. Sherman Antitrust Act, 1890 gave us the Sherman Antitrust Act, America's first attempt to break up monopolies and protect competition. Senator John Sherman argued that corporate trusts were becoming more powerful than the government itself, which was genuinely concerning. The act passed with overwhelming support, making it illegal to monopolize trade or commerce. Except, here's the twist nobody saw coming. The first major use of the Sherman Act wasn't against monopolies, it was against labor unions. Courts ruled that strikes and boycotts were conspiracies in restraint of trade. The Pullman strike of 1894 got crushed using antitrust law. Eugene Debs went to jail. Unions, the very organizations fighting against monopolistic corporate power, got targeted by the law meant to restrain that power. It took decades before the act was actually used against trusts the way Sherman intended. Standard Oil finally got broken up in 1911. Sometimes laws get weaponized against the exact opposite targets their authors intended, though federal policy toward Native Americans would prove even more devastating in its reversal. Dawes Act. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act with the stated goal of integrating Native Americans into American economic life. Reformers believed that communal land ownership stood in the way of assimilation and prosperity. The solution they proposed was simple on paper. Divide tribal lands into individual allotments. Heads of households received parcels of land, while remaining acreage labeled surplus was open to non-native settlement. What followed reshaped the geography of Native America. Over the next several decades, tribal landholdings were broken into fragmented parcels governed by different legal rules. Ownership became divided among individuals, families, and outside purchasers, creating a complex checkerboard of control that made coordinated land use increasingly difficult. While some policymakers believed they were promoting self-sufficiency, the long-term consequences were severe. Tribes lost millions of acres through sales legal disputes, and administrative decisions. Traditional governance structures weakened as land ownership shifted from collective stewardship to individual responsibility within unfamiliar systems. By the early 20th century, it had become clear that the policy had failed to achieve its intended outcomes. Instead of stability, it produced uncertainty. Instead of integration, it created lasting disruption. The Dawes Act stands as an example of how federal policy, even when framed as reform, can generate consequences far beyond what its authors imagined, especially when imposed without the consent of the people most affected. And, as the federal government reconsidered its approach to indigenous policy, it was also quietly reshaping the rules of global engagement. Chinese Exclusion Act renewal. 1892 brought the Geary Act, renewing and expanding the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Not content with just banning Chinese laborers from entering the country, the Geary Act required all Chinese residents to carry certificates of residence at all times or face deportation. Basically, internal passports for one specific ethnic group. The act also denied Chinese immigrants the right to bail in habeas corpus proceedings and made it nearly impossible for Chinese people to testify in court. Family reunification became almost impossible. Chinese men already in America couldn't bring wives or children over. This created the paper sons era, where men would claim false identities as sons of Chinese American citizens, memorizing elaborate family histories to pass immigration interrogations. Angel Island in San Francisco Bay became the Ellis Island for Chinese immigrants, except instead of welcoming people, it detained them for weeks or months in harsh conditions while officials tried to catch them in lies. Exclusion wasn't just about keeping people out, it was about making life unbearable for those already here. Though diplomatic solutions to immigration tensions would occasionally emerge through international agreements, Gentleman's Agreement. 1907 gave us the Gentleman's Agreement, which sounds civilized until you realize it was basically, please stop sending us your people dressed up in diplomatic language. San Francisco's school board had segregated Japanese students into separate schools, and Japan was furious. This was a rising world power, not a nation to be casually insulted. War tensions escalated. Teddy Roosevelt, trying to avoid conflict with Japan, while also appeasing West Coast racism, negotiated a deal. Japan would voluntarily restrict emigration of laborers to the U.S., and, in exchange, San Francisco would desegregate its schools. Japan agreed because maintaining national honor mattered more than the right of its citizens to emigrate. The agreement reduced Japanese immigration significantly but couldn't stop the racism driving it. California still passed alien land laws preventing Japanese immigrants from owning property. The diplomatic solution satisfied neither side. Japan felt humiliated, and West Coast exclusionists kept pushing for more restrictions, eventually getting them with the Immigration Act of 1924. Sometimes agreements just postponed conflicts rather than resolving them, though the next diplomatic incident would actually pull America into global war. Zimmerman Telegram. January 1917 brought us the Zimmerman Telegram, which is basically proof that intercepted messages can change history. Arthur Zimmerman, Germany's foreign secretary, sent a coded telegram to Mexico proposing an alliance. If the U.S. entered World War I, Mexico should attack and reclaim Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Germany would provide funding and support. It was a desperate gamble to keep America neutral by threatening its southern border. British codebreakers intercepted it, decrypted it, and handed it to the U.S. government. When newspapers published it in March, American public opinion shifted dramatically. The telegram made the war feel personal. This wasn't just European politics anymore. This was Germany actively plotting against American territory. Woodrow Wilson, who'd been re-elected on the promise of keeping America out of war, asked Congress for a declaration of war in April. The telegram didn't cause U.S. entry alone, but it shattered isolationist arguments and made intervention feel necessary. One intercepted message, and suddenly Americans were heading to the trenches, though wartime restrictions on speech would prove domestic liberties were also casualties. Sedition Act of 1918. May 1918 gave us the Sedition Act, which made it illegal to criticize the government during wartime. Like, genuinely illegal. You could be imprisoned for up to 20 years for speaking or writing anything disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive about the government, the Constitution, the military, or the flag. Over 2,000 people were prosecuted. Socialist leader Eugene Debs gave an anti-war speech in Canton, Ohio, and got sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. He ran for president from his cell in 1920 and got nearly 1 million votes. The act wasn't about protecting national security, it was about silencing dissent. Anti-war activists, labor organizers, immigrants, and anyone questioning Wilson's policies faced prosecution. The Supreme Court upheld convictions, with Oliver Wendell Holmes writing opinions that later jurisprudence would essentially repudiate. The act expired in 1921, but it established a template. During crisis, civil liberties become negotiable. Wartime fear plus government power equals suppressed speech. Though sometimes the crackdown on dissent came through direct action rather than just legislation. Palmer raids. In the years immediately following World War I, America entered a period of deep anxiety about political instability. Revolutions were spreading overseas, labor strikes were erupting at home, and many officials feared the country was on the brink of radical upheaval. In response, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer launched a series of federal investigations aimed at identifying political extremists. What followed became known as the Palmer Raids, not as a single event, but as a coordinated campaign of surveillance, monitoring, and enforcement carried out across dozens of cities. Federal agents compiled extensive lists of suspected radicals, tracking political beliefs rather than criminal activity. Meetings were observed, correspondence examined, and organizations mapped in remarkable detail. For many people swept up in the investigations, there were no formal charges, just scrutiny, questioning, and administrative consequences. A young Justice Department official named J. Edgar Hoover played a central role in organizing the information. He developed filing systems, indexes, and cross-referency that allowed the federal government to monitor political movements at an unprecedented scale. The techniques themselves mattered as much as the immediate results. Public concern eventually grew. Critics questioned whether fear had begun to override constitutional protections, and courts gradually pushed back against the most aggressive practices. But the infrastructure remained. The Palmer raids didn't just respond to a moment of panic, they quietly established the foundations of modern federal surveillance. Long after the fear faded, the systems built to manage it stayed in place, and sometimes, those systems outlast the reasons they were created. Scopes Trial. July 1925 brought us the Scopes Trial in Dayton, Tennessee, where a high school teacher was prosecuted for teaching evolution. John Scopes agreed to be a test case challenging Tennessee's Butler Act, which banned teaching anything contradicting biblical creation. The trial became a media circus, the first to be broadcast on radio nationwide. William Jennings Bryan prosecuted, Clarence Darrow defended, and journalists from across the country descended on small-town Tennessee. The trial wasn't really about Scopes, it was about modernity versus tradition, science versus religion, urban versus rural values. Scopes was convicted and fined $100, though the conviction was later overturned on a technicality. But the cultural impact was massive. The trial modernized American media coverage, proved radio's power to create national events, and crystallized the evolution debate in ways we're still dealing with. Science won the intellectual argument but lost the local battle. The case revealed America's deep cultural divides, broadcast them to millions, and basically invented modern media spectacle trials, though citizenship rights would also expand during this era, at least on paper. Indian Citizenship Act. June 1924 brought us the Indian Citizenship Act, granting citizenship to all Native Americans born in the United States. Sounds straightforward, even overdue, but of course there's a catch. The act didn't automatically grant voting rights. States controlled voting, and many states, including Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, continued blocking Native people from voting for decades. They used literacy tests, residency requirements, and arguments that reservation residents weren't subject to state jurisdiction. Some states claimed Native Americans didn't pay property taxes, so they couldn't vote. Others said they were under guardianship and therefore incompetent. It took until 1965 and the Voting Rights Act before all Native Americans could actually exercise their citizenship through voting. The gap between legal citizenship and actual political participation lasted 40 years. The act was progress, certainly, but progress that existed mainly on paper, while states found creative ways to maintain exclusion. Sometimes rights granted federally still need to be fought for locally, state by state, year after year, though economic policy would also undermine prosperity in ways the government failed to anticipate. Hawley-Smoot tariff. June 1930 brought us the Hawley-Smoot tariff, quite possibly the worst-timed economic policy in American history. The economy was already collapsing, and Congress decided this was the perfect moment to raise tariffs to the highest levels in American history. Over 20,000 goods saw tariff increases. The idea was to protect American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition. What actually happened? Other countries retaliated with their own tariffs. Global trade collapsed, American exports fell 60% by 1933. The tariff turned a severe recession into the Great Depression, deepening and extending the economic catastrophe. 1,000 economists signed a petition begging President Hoover to veto it. He signed it anyway. Within 2 years, global trade had contracted by about 2/3. Unemployment skyrocketed. It's one of those policy disasters that gets studied in economics classes as a cautionary tale about protectionism and retaliation. Sometimes trying to protect your economy just destroys everyone's economy instead. Though Roosevelt would eventually find a different approach to international trade. Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. June 1934 brought us the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, which was basically FDR's way of undoing the Hawley-Smoot disaster without explicitly saying, "We screwed up." The act authorized the president to negotiate bilateral trade agreements, reducing tariffs by up to 50% without congressional approval. It was revolutionary. Congress had always controlled tariffs directly, but they'd just proven they couldn't be trusted with that power. Roosevelt used the authority to negotiate trade deals with countries willing to lower their tariffs on American goods. Within 3 years, the U.S. had agreements with 14 countries. Exports started recovering. The act established the framework for American trade policy for decades, eventually evolving into the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and later the World Trade Organization. It proved that reducing trade barriers helps everyone, or at least hurts less than trade wars do. The shift from congressional micromanagement to executive flexibility fundamentally changed how America engaged with global commerce. Though engaging with the global conflicts of the era would require navigating strict neutrality laws first. Neutrality Acts. The mid-1930s brought a series of Neutrality Acts, passed by a Congress absolutely determined not to repeat World War I. The 1935 Act banned arms sales to belligerents. The 1936 Act banned loans to nations at war. The 1937 Act extended this to civil wars, which meant the U.S. couldn't help Republican Spain against Franco's fascists. Roosevelt hated these laws. He could see another world war coming and knew rigid neutrality would help aggressors, but isolationist sentiment was overwhelming. The acts essentially tied the president's hands in foreign policy. Then came the cash and carry provision in 1939. Belligerents could buy American goods if they paid cash and transported them on their own ships. This technically maintained neutrality, while obviously favoring Britain and France, who had navies and cash, over Germany. The loophole eventually led to Lend-Lease. But the Neutrality Acts represented peak American isolationism, the last gasp of "not our problem," before Pearl Harbor made everything everyone's problem. Though Roosevelt would find creative ways to support allies before formal war entry. Lend-Lease Act. March 1941 gave us the Lend-Lease Act, which was Roosevelt's brilliant workaround for helping Britain fight the Nazis while technically remaining neutral. Britain was broke, nearly defeated, and couldn't afford to buy American weapons under cash and carry rules. FDR came up with this. America would lend war materials to any country whose defense was vital to U.S. security. Roosevelt compared it to lending your neighbor a garden hose. When their house is on fire, you don't demand payment. You help put out the fire and get the hose back later. Congress authorized $50 billion in aid eventually. The act turned America into the arsenal of democracy, producing weapons, food, and supplies for Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and other allies. By the time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December, America was already deeply involved in the war economically. Lend-Lease proved isolationism was dead even before formal belligerency. Sometimes you can be neutral and partisan simultaneously if you're creative enough about definitions, though America would keep even bigger secrets during the war itself. Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project employed over 130,000 people during World War II, and somehow, most of them didn't know what they were actually building. The atomic bomb program was so secretive that workers at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, didn't know they were enriching uranium. They just knew they operated machines with very specific instructions. Los Alamos, New Mexico, didn't officially exist, it was simply P.O. Box, 1663, Santa Fe. Babies born there had birth certificates listing that P.O. Box as their birthplace. Wives didn't know what their husbands did. Scientists couldn't discuss their work. The security was so intense that even Vice President Harry Truman didn't know about the bomb until after Roosevelt died and he became president. When the first atomic bomb was tested at Trinity Site in July 1945, the government told locals it was an ammunition depot explosion. The project cost about $2 billion, equivalent to about $30 billion today, all hidden in budgets and classified programs. Creating the atomic age required unprecedented secrecy. Though not all wartime injustices stayed hidden from view. The Port Chicago case and military reform. In July 1944, a military facility at Port Chicago, California, became the focus of a quiet but pivotal turning point inside the U.S. Armed Forces. The base was responsible for loading munitions bound for the Pacific Theater during World War II. The work was dangerous, highly technical, and carried out under intense pressure. At the time, the Navy operated under strict racial segregation, assigning black sailors almost exclusively to loading duties while white officers supervised. After a catastrophic accident destroyed the facility, surviving sailors were ordered to resume the same work under the same conditions. A group of them refused, citing safety concerns and the absence of proper training. Their refusal was treated not as a labor dispute or safety objection, but as a disciplinary matter. The resulting legal proceedings drew attention well beyond the base. Civil rights advocates, journalists, and legal observers began asking difficult questions about fairness, segregation, and responsibility within the military justice system. Thurgood Marshall, then a lawyer for the NAACP, monitored the case closely and later documented systemic racial disparities in how discipline was applied. Although the Navy initially resisted change, the Port Chicago case contributed to mounting pressure for reform. It became one of several factors that led military leaders to reconsider segregation policies, especially as wartime demands made equality increasingly practical as well as moral. The episode demonstrated how institutional change often begins not with speeches or legislation, but with individuals challenging systems from inside them. Port Chicago didn't instantly transform the military, but it helped push it toward reforms that would follow in the years ahead. And sometimes, those internal reckonings lead directly to decisions made at the highest level of government. Executive Order 9981, July 26, 1948, brought Executive Order 9981, quietly desegregating the U.S. military by presidential decree. Truman didn't wait for Congress or public opinion to catch up, he just signed the order requiring equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed forces. It was a huge deal, though it happened before Brown v. Board of Education made segregation explicitly unconstitutional. The military initially resisted. The Army dragged its feet until the Korean War forced integration out of practical necessity. Segregated units were inefficient in combat. By 1954, the military was functionally desegregated, proving integration could work even when many people insisted it couldn't. The order became a template for civil rights advancement. Federal action, forcing change ahead of public consensus. Truman's decision was partly moral, partly political. He needed black votes, but the result was genuine progress. The military became one of the most integrated institutions in American society, ironically through executive fiat rather than democratic process. Sometimes progress requires someone just deciding it's happening, resistance be damned. Though Cold War paranoia would simultaneously produce restrictive legislation, McCarran Internal Security Act, September 23, 1950, brought the McCarran Internal Security Act, peak Red Scare legislation requiring communist organizations to register with the government. The act created the Subversive Activities Control Board, authorized detention camps for suspected subversives during emergencies, and restricted communists from working in defense industries or traveling abroad. Truman vetoed it, calling it the greatest danger to freedom of speech, press, and assembly since the Alien and Sedition Acts. Congress overrode his veto anyway. The act chilled political speech and activism for years. Nobody wanted to be investigated or blacklisted. The Supreme Court eventually struck down several provisions, but the psychological impact lasted longer than the legal authority. The detention camp provision, in particular, is nightmare fuel. The government could round up and indefinitely detain people based on suspected future behavior during internal security emergencies. Thankfully, it was never used, but its existence on the books said everything about how fear can override constitutional principles. Sometimes democracy protects itself by undermining the freedoms it claims to defend, though international nuclear policy would take a more optimistic turn, at least in public presentation. Atoms for Peace. December 8, 1953 brought Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech to the United Nations, proposing international cooperation on nuclear technology. The speech was beautiful. Idealistic nations would contribute atomic materials to an international atomic energy agency, which would promote peaceful uses of nuclear power worldwide. It sounded like turning swords into plowshares for the atomic age. The program did help establish nuclear power plants globally and created the IAEA, which still monitors nuclear materials today. But it was also public relations masking continued weapons development. America and the Soviet Union kept building bombs while talking about peace. The program spread nuclear technology worldwide, which was the point, but also increased proliferation risks, which wasn't ideal. Atoms for Peace was genuine in its goals, but naive about human nature and international competition. The speech represented Eisenhower's better instincts. He genuinely worried about the nuclear arms race, but couldn't overcome the Cold War logic driving it. Sometimes, optimistic rhetoric serves multiple purposes simultaneously, not all of them peaceful. Though domestic civil rights would soon require more concrete federal action than just speeches. Little Rock 9. September 1957 brought the Little Rock 9 crisis, when 9 black students tried to integrate Central High School in Arkansas. Governor Orville Faubus deployed the Arkansas National Guard to prevent them from entering, defying the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board ruling 3 years earlier. Images of Elizabeth Eckford, one of the 9, walking through a screaming mob of white students and adults, went worldwide. Eisenhower, who privately opposed forced integration and had hoped to avoid involvement, finally had no choice. He federalized the Arkansas National Guard and sent the 101st Airborne Division to protect the students. For the first time since Reconstruction, the federal government used military force to protect black civil rights in the South. Eisenhower's reluctant action established that federal authority would enforce constitutional rights even against state resistance. The Little Rock crisis internationalized American racism. Soviet propaganda had a field day and forced the federal government to choose sides. Sometimes presidents do the right thing despite their personal hesitations, pushed by circumstances beyond their control. Though Cold War espionage would create its own public relations disasters, U-2 incident. May 1, 1960 brought the U-2 incident, when the Soviet Union shot down an American spy plane deep inside their territory. Eisenhower initially denied it was a spy plane, claiming it was a weather research aircraft that had strayed off course. Then the Soviets produced the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, alive and confessing, "Oops." Eisenhower had to admit the U.S. had been conducting surveillance flights over the USSR for years. The Paris summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev collapsed immediately. Khrushchev used the incident for massive propaganda victory, portraying America as untrustworthy aggressors. The shootdown revealed American intelligence operations, embarrassed the administration, and poisoned U.S. Soviet relations, just as they seemed to be thawing. Powers was convicted of espionage in a show trial and sentenced to 10 years, though he was exchanged for Soviet spy Rudolf Abel in 1962. The incident proved Cold War détente was fragile and that getting caught lying to the world is worse than the spying itself. Sometimes failed covert operations become very overt disasters, though Kennedy would develop his own controversial approach to Cold War interventions. Flexibility Doctrine. 1961 brought Kennedy's Flexibility Doctrine, which sounds innocuous until you realize it meant supporting anti-communist dictators, regardless of their human rights records. The doctrine shifted from Eisenhower's massive retaliation strategy to a more nuanced approach. Counterinsurgency, special forces, covert operations, and flexible military responses. In practice, this meant the U.S. backed coups and authoritarian regimes across Latin America as long as they opposed communism. The Alliance for Progress promised economic aid and democratic reform, but when push came to shove, stability trumped democracy. The doctrine supported the military coup in Brazil in 1964. It backed dictatorships in Guatemala, El Salvador, and elsewhere. Kennedy genuinely believed he was preventing communist expansion, but the long-term result was American complicity in authoritarian violence across the hemisphere. The Green Berets became symbols of this new approach, elite warriors fighting insurgencies in the shadows. Sometimes fighting one ideology means embracing regimes just as troubling, just pointed in a different direction. Though Congress would grant even broader war powers based on questionable events in Southeast Asia, Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. August 1964 marked one of the most consequential moments in modern American foreign policy, though few people realized it at the time. Reports emerged that U.S. naval vessels operating in the Gulf of Tonkin had encountered hostile actions while conducting patrols off the coast of North Vietnam. The details were unclear, fragmented, and arriving through layers of military and intelligence interpretation. What mattered politically was how quickly events moved from uncertainty to certainty. President Lyndon Johnson addressed the nation and framed the situation as a direct challenge to American forces. Within days, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution with overwhelming support. The resolution granted the president broad authority to take military action in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. At the time, it was presented as a limited, defensive measure, flexibility in case of further incidents. In practice, it became something much larger. The resolution effectively transferred Congress's war-making authority to the executive branch, setting a precedent that future presidents would rely on again and again. Later analysis raised questions about the accuracy and interpretation of the original reports, but by then the resolution had already reshaped American policy. What mattered most wasn't what happened on the water, it was how uncertainty became authorization, and authorization became escalation. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution quietly redefined how America enters conflicts, proving that the most lasting changes in power often arrive through emergency votes passed in moments of urgency rather than careful deliberation. And, while Congress was redefining authority overseas, the military itself was confronting long-standing inequalities at home. Medicare Act signing. July 30, 1965, brought the signing of the Medicare Act at the Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri. Johnson specifically chose this location to honor Harry Truman, who'd first proposed national health insurance back in 1945 and been absolutely destroyed politically for it. The American Medical Association, called Truman's Plan Socialized Medicine, launched a massive lobbying campaign against it and killed it completely. 20 years later, LBJ succeeded where Truman had failed, creating Medicare for seniors and Medicaid for low-income Americans. At the ceremony, Johnson gave Truman and his wife the first 2 Medicare cards as symbolic recognition. The act fundamentally transformed American healthcare, providing coverage to millions of elderly Americans who'd previously gone without. It wasn't universal healthcare, that battle is still ongoing, but it proved government health insurance could work despite decades of opposition claiming it would destroy American medicine. Sometimes vindication takes 20 years, but the wait makes the moment sweeter. Immigration Act, Family Reunification. October 3, 1965, brought the Immigration and Nationality Act, also called Hart-Celler, which we've mentioned before, but the family reunification priority deserves its own focus. The act prioritized family connections over national origin quotas, allowing immigrants to sponsor relatives. This seemed reasonable, families should be together, but it created what critics would later call chain migration. One immigrant could sponsor parents, who could sponsor siblings, who could sponsor their spouses and children, who could sponsor their relatives, creating immigration chains that continued for generations. The demographic impact was massive and unexpected. Asian immigration increased dramatically from 7% of immigrants in 1960 to over 40% by 2000. Latin American immigration also surged. The act fundamentally diversified America in ways policymakers didn't predict or necessarily intend. Family reunification sounds apolitical, but it's actually a powerful multiplier of immigration patterns. Sometimes, the secondary effects of policy choices matter more than the primary ones. Though civil rights legislation passed during this era would take even longer to properly enforce. Fair Housing Act. April 11, 1968 brought the Fair Housing Act, passed just days after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, while cities were still burning. The act banned racial discrimination in housing sales and rentals, finally addressing redlining and segregation in lending and real estate. It was supposed to end the systematic exclusion of Black Americans from homeownership and wealth building. On paper, it was revolutionary. In practice, enforcement was practically non-existent for decades. The act had no real enforcement mechanism initially. Victims had to file private lawsuits, which was expensive and difficult. The Department of Housing and Urban Development could investigate complaints but couldn't impose penalties. Real estate agents kept discriminating. Banks kept redlining, and segregated housing patterns persisted. It took the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988 20 years later to add actual enforcement teeth. The original act was a symbolic victory that changed law but not reality, proof that rights without enforcement mechanisms are just paper promises. Sometimes legislation is the beginning of change, not the completion of it. Though environmental policy would see more immediate institutional results. EPA creation. December 2, 1970 brought the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. And here's something that often gets forgotten. Richard Nixon created it. The EPA consolidated environmental responsibilities from multiple agencies into one powerful regulatory body with actual enforcement authority. Nixon was responding to massive public pressure after events like the Cuyahoga River catching fire and the Santa Barbara oil spill. The first Earth Day in April 1970 drew 20 million participants. Nixon, pragmatic if nothing else, recognized the political moment and acted. The EPA set pollution standards, enforced environmental laws, and fundamentally changed how America approached air and water quality. Within a decade, rivers stopped catching fire. Air quality improved dramatically in major cities. The EPA became one of the most consequential regulatory agencies in American government, and it came from a conservative Republican president responding to public demand. Sometimes environmental protection isn't partisan, it's pragmatic response to observable disasters. Though congressional attempts to limit presidential war powers would prove more contentious. War Powers Resolution. November 7, 1973 brought the War Powers Resolution, passed over Nixon's veto by a Congress absolutely done with presidents starting wars without formal declarations. Vietnam had dragged on for years under the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and legislators wanted their constitutional war-making authority back. The resolution requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of deploying troops and limits deployment to 60 days without congressional authorization, with a 30-day withdrawal period. It was supposed to prevent future Vietnams. In practice, it's been largely symbolic. Presidents still deploy troops and then dare Congress to defund them or force withdrawal, which Congress rarely has the political will to do. Every president since Nixon has claimed the resolution is unconstitutional, though none has really tested it directly. The War Powers Resolution represents legislative intent to reclaim authority more than actual constraint on executive action. Sometimes constitutional checks and balances depend more on institutional will than legal text. Though congressional investigations would prove more effective at exposing executive overreach. Church Committee. 1975 brought the Church Committee, officially the Senate Select Committee, to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, led by Senator Frank Church. The committee investigated U.S. intelligence agencies and discovered absolutely wild stuff. The CIA had conducted mind control experiments on unwitting subjects through Project MKUltra. The FBI had run COINTELPRO, infiltrating and disrupting civil rights organizations and political groups. Intelligence agencies had plotted assassinations of foreign leaders, including Castro, Lumumba, and others. They'd opened mail, tapped phones without warrants, and conducted surveillance on American citizens engaged in lawful political activity. The revelations shocked the public and led to real reforms. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act created FISA courts to oversee electronic surveillance, and intelligence oversight committees became permanent fixtures in Congress. The Church Committee proved that secret agencies without oversight inevitably abuse their power. It's one of those rare moments when congressional investigation actually led to substantive reform rather than just partisan theater, though the Supreme Court would also weigh in on affirmative action policies during this era. Bakke decision. June 28, 1978, brought Regents of the University of California v. Bakke, the Supreme Court's first major affirmative action decision. Alan Bakke, a white applicant, sued UC Davis Medical School after being rejected twice, while the school admitted minority applicants with lower test scores through a special admissions program that reserved 16 of 100 spots for underrepresented minorities. The court ruled 5-4 that strict racial quotas were unconstitutional, but also ruled 5-4 that race could be considered as one factor among many in admissions decisions. Justice Powell's controlling opinion threaded an impossible needle. You can pursue diversity but can't use explicit quotas to achieve it. The decision created the framework for affirmative action debates for the next 45 years. Universities could consider race, but how much and in what ways remained perpetually contested. Bakke established that diversity was a compelling interest but left the methods for achieving it frustratingly ambiguous. The case satisfied nobody completely, but established a shaky compromise that survived until recently. Though foreign policy in Asia would require its own careful balancing act, Taiwan Relations Act. April 10, 1979, brought the Taiwan Relations Act, a congressional response to Carter's decision to recognize the People's Republic of China and break formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan. The act was Congress basically saying, fine, we'll recognize Beijing, but we're keeping Taiwan as a strategic partner anyway. It committed the U.S. to providing Taiwan with defensive weapons and treating any attempt to determine Taiwan's future by non-peaceful means as a grave concern. The act created the American Institute in Taiwan, a non-governmental organization that functions exactly like an embassy, but technically isn't because we don't have diplomatic relations. It's one of the most successful diplomatic fictions in history. For over 40 years, the act has allowed the U.S. to maintain the One China policy, while also ensuring Taiwan's security and independence. Beijing hates it, but tolerates it. Taiwan depends on it. The act represents strategic ambiguity as actual policy, deliberately unclear commitments that everyone interprets differently. which somehow works because precision would force confrontation. Sometimes vagueness is a feature, not a bug. Though domestic economic policy would take a more definitive turn. Volcker shock. October 6, 1979 brought Paul Volcker's appointment as Federal Reserve Chair, and he immediately decided to murder inflation through interest rate increases. The late 70s had double-digit inflation, prices rising over 13% annually, eroding savings and destabilizing the economy. Volcker raised the federal funds rate to unprecedented levels, eventually hitting 20% by June 1981, 20%. The policy deliberately triggered a severe recession. Unemployment rose to nearly 11%. Businesses failed. Farmers lost everything as debt costs exploded. The pain was immense and immediate, but inflation broke. By 1983, inflation had fallen below 4%, setting the stage for decades of relatively stable prices. The Volcker shock proved central banks could control inflation through sheer willingness to accept short-term economic devastation. It also shifted American economic thinking toward monetarism and away from Keynesian demand management, creating the intellectual foundation for Reaganomics. Sometimes saving the economy requires almost destroying it first. Though international crises would also reshape American politics through media coverage. Iran hostage crisis coverage. November 4, 1979 brought the seizure of the American embassy in Tehran, beginning the Iran hostage crisis that would last 444 days. But the crisis's impact on American politics came as much from media coverage as from the events themselves. ABC started a nightly update called The Iran Crisis, America Held Hostage, hosted by Ted Koppel, which counted each day of captivity, day 50, day 100, day 300. The daily count became a national obsession and a constant reminder of American powerlessness. Carter tried a rescue mission in April 1980 that failed spectacularly when helicopters crashed in the desert, killing 8 servicemen. Every day the crisis continued. Carter's presidency weakened. The program was so successful that, after the hostages were finally released on Reagan's inauguration day, Iran's final insult to Carter ABC kept the format and created Nightline, which still runs today. The crisis didn't just damage Carter politically, it transformed American news into a daily drumbeat of foreign policy crisis coverage. Sometimes, media coverage becomes the crisis as much as the events being covered. Though cultural shifts in the 80s would arrive through entertainment media as well. MTV launch. August 1, 1981, brought MTV. Launching with the Buggles, video killed the radio star, which was appropriate given what was about to happen to radio's cultural dominance. MTV fundamentally changed how music was consumed, marketed, and created. Suddenly, artists needed to be visually compelling, not just musically talented. Image became as important as sound. Michael Jackson's Thriller video in 1983 became a cultural event. Madonna built her career on visual reinvention. MTV created youth culture as a distinct market segment, with its own aesthetics, politics, and consumption patterns. The channel influenced fashion, language, and social attitudes. It made careers and ended them if you weren't photogenic enough. MTV was also initially criticized for barely playing black artists, requiring pressure and Michael Jackson's undeniable popularity to force integration. The channel eventually became more important as a cultural platform than as a music source. The Real World and other reality shows transformed television itself. For a few decades, MTV was the primary cultural transmission belt for youth culture. Though the AIDS crisis would demand more serious cultural attention and political response. AIDS quilt display. October 11, 1987 brought the first display of the AIDS Memorial Quilt on the National Mall in Washington. The quilt consisted of 1,920 individual panels, each commemorating someone who died of AIDS. It covered a space larger than a football field. 500,000 people came to see it. Each panel represented a life, a story, a community's grief. The quilt humanized AIDS in a way statistics couldn't. These weren't just numbers in a public health crisis, they were sons, brothers, friends, artists, teachers. The display forced the public to confront the scale of loss and the government's inadequate response. Reagan had barely mentioned AIDS publicly, despite tens of thousands of deaths. The quilt became a powerful advocacy tool, pressuring politicians to increase funding and research. It grew to over 48,000 panels eventually, weighing over 54 tons. The quilt represented community action in the face of government indifference, proof that sometimes cultural activism precedes policy change. When authorities won't acknowledge a crisis, communities create monuments that make ignoring it impossible. Though the next administration would focus on different civil rights expansions, Americans with Disabilities Act, July 26, 1990, brought the Americans with Disabilities Act, signed by George H. W. Bush, fundamentally transforming physical access in America. The ADA required businesses, public spaces, and employers to provide reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. Suddenly, buildings needed ramps, bathrooms needed accessible stalls. Businesses couldn't discriminate in hiring based on disability. The Act defined disability broadly, covering physical, mental, and chronic conditions. Curb cuts appeared everywhere, those little ramps at intersections that wheelchair users need but everyone benefits from. Buses got lifts. Public transportation became accessible. The physical landscape of America changed visibly and permanently. Bush, who'd had personal experience with disability in his family, called the ADA the world's first comprehensive declaration of equality for people with disabilities. The act passed with broad bipartisan support, proving some civil rights expansions could still achieve consensus. Sometimes, infrastructure changes are the most powerful civil rights interventions. Building access into the environment makes inclusion automatic rather than optional. Though gun control legislation would prove more politically fraught, even when inspired by personal tragedy. Brady Bill. November 30, 1993 brought the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, requiring federal background checks for gun purchases. The law was named for James Brady, Reagan's press secretary who was shot and permanently disabled during the 1981 assassination attempt on Reagan. Brady and his wife Sarah became gun control advocates, pushing for the background check requirement for over a decade. The NRA fought it fiercely. The bill finally passed under Clinton as part of a broader crime bill. The Brady Bill created the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, which has since blocked over 3 million gun sales to prohibited purchasers. It represented the first significant federal gun control legislation in decades, proving that even modest regulation was possible, despite intense opposition. The law didn't ban any guns or limit purchases beyond requiring checks, it just added a procedural step. Yet, it took a presidential press secretary being shot, over 10 years of advocacy, and specific political circumstances to pass even this minimal requirement. Sometimes, even small regulations require enormous political capital, though welfare policy would see more dramatic restructuring. Welfare reform. August 22, 1996, brought the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which Clinton famously said would end welfare as we know it. And it did. The act replaced aid to families with dependent children, which had provided unlimited assistance, with temporary assistance for needy families, which imposed time limits and work requirements. Recipients could only receive benefits for 5 years total in their lifetime. They had to work or participate in work activities. States got block grants and flexibility in implementation. The reform was intended to break cycles of dependency and encourage work. Results were mixed. Welfare rolls dropped dramatically from 12 million in 1996 to 4 million by 2000. But many who left welfare ended up in low-wage jobs without benefits, not substantially better off. When the 2008 recession hit, the system proved less responsive to need than the previous one. The reform represented Clinton's third-way politics, adopting conservative policy goals with democratic implementation. It satisfied neither progressives nor conservatives completely but fundamentally restructured America's safety net. Sometimes, compromise means everyone gets something they don't want, though technological fears would also drive massive spending as the millennium approached. Y2K preparations. The late 1990s brought Y2K panic, the fear that computer systems would fail when dates rolled over from 1999 to 2000. Early programmers, trying to save memory, had used 2 digits for years instead of 4. Would computers think 2000 was 1900? Would systems crash, planes fall from the sky, financial systems collapse, nuclear reactors melt down? The doomsday predictions were wild. Governments and businesses spent an estimated $100 billion globally fixing code, updating systems, and preparing for potential failures. The U.S. government alone spent over $8 billion. Companies hired programmers to search through millions of lines of code, finding date references and updating them. As midnight approached on December 31st, 1999, everyone held their breath. And then, basically nothing happened. Some minor glitches, but no catastrophes. Critics claimed Y2K was overblown hysteria. Defenders said the preparations prevented disaster. The truth is probably that both are correct. There were real problems, but massive investment solved them before they could cause chaos. Sometimes successful disaster prevention looks like pointless panic in hindsight. Though education reform would create ongoing rather than temporary controversies. No Child Left Behind Act. January 8, 2002, brought No Child Left Behind. George W. Bush's signature education reform, passed with bipartisan support, including Ted Kennedy's crucial backing. The law required annual standardized testing in reading and math for grades 3 through 8, with schools facing consequences for failing to meet adequate yearly progress. The goal was accountability and closing achievement gaps. The implementation created a testing-obsessed education culture. Teachers taught to tests. Schools narrowed curriculum to tested subjects. Art, music, and social studies got squeezed out. Schools serving disadvantaged students faced the harshest penalties, despite having the toughest challenges. The law's good intentions, ensuring all children received quality education, regardless of zip code, ran into the reality that standardized tests measure test-taking skills as much as knowledge, and punishing struggling schools doesn't magically improve them. By Obama's second term, most states had received waivers exempting them from requirements. The law proved that accountability without adequate resources and support just creates data about failure rather than fixing it. Sometimes, measuring problems becomes a substitute for solving them. Though the Supreme Court would dramatically reshape campaign finance, despite no actual legislative reform, Citizens United ruling, January 21, 2010, brought Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission, a Supreme Court decision that transformed American politics by declaring that corporations and unions could spend unlimited amounts on political campaigns. The 5-4 decision ruled that independent political spending was protected speech under the First Amendment and that the government couldn't restrict it. Justice Kennedy's majority opinion claimed independent expenditures couldn't corrupt politicians because they weren't coordinated with campaigns. Justice Stevens' dissent warned of corporate money flooding elections and drowning out individual voices. He was right. Super PACs emerged immediately, political action committees that could raise and spend unlimited funds as long as they didn't coordinate directly with candidates. Campaign spending exploded. The 2012 election saw over $1 billion in Super PAC spending. Dark money groups proliferated, hiding donor identities. Wealthy individuals and corporations gained enormously enhanced political influence. The decision didn't change any law Congress passed. It struck down parts of McCain-Feingold campaign finance reform. Sometimes 5 justices can reshape democracy more dramatically than elected officials. Though executive action on immigration would create similar controversies around institutional authority. DACA, Executive Order, June 15, 2012, brought deferred action for childhood arrivals. Obama's executive order protecting young undocumented immigrants brought to the U.S. as children. Congress had repeatedly failed to pass the DREAM Act, which would have provided these young people a path to citizenship. Obama, frustrated with legislative gridlock, used executive authority to defer deportation and grant work permits to those who qualified. About 800,000 people received DACA protection. Recipients, called Dreamers, could work legally, go to college, build lives without fear of deportation. The program became immediately controversial. Republicans called it executive overreach and unconstitutional amnesty. Supporters argued it was prosecutorial discretion, a routine executive power. Trump tried to end DACA, but the Supreme Court blocked him on procedural grounds. The program's continued existence remains precarious, dependent on executive whim and judicial interpretation rather than legislation. DACA exemplifies how executive action can fill policy voids, but creates vulnerable, temporary solutions that leave people in permanent uncertainty. Sometimes helping requires end-running democracy, which creates its own problems. Though the Supreme Court would also surprise observers by preserving rather than destroying major healthcare reform. Affordable Care Act upheld. June 28, 2012, brought the Supreme Court's decision, upholding the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate, the requirement that Americans buy health insurance or pay a penalty. The mandate was the most controversial part of Obamacare. Republicans challenged it as unconstitutional. Congress couldn't force people to buy a product. The fate of the entire law hung on this question. Chief Justice John Roberts, a conservative appointed by Bush, provided the crucial fifth vote to uphold it. His reasoning surprised everyone. The mandate was constitutional as a tax, not as a regulation of commerce. If you didn't buy insurance, you paid more taxes. That was within Congress's taxing authority. Roberts's decision saved the ACA and expanded health coverage to millions. It showed a conservative justice prioritizing institutional legitimacy over partisan outcomes. The decision revealed how much constitutional interpretation depends on framing. Call it a mandate, and it's unconstitutional. Call it a tax, and it's fine. Same policy, different legal theory, opposite result. Sometimes clever legal reasoning matters more than political preference, though cultural shifts on marriage equality would prove even more dramatic and swift. Obergefell decision. June 26, 2015 brought Obergefell v. Hodges, the Supreme Court decision legalizing same-sex marriage nationwide. The 5-4 decision, with Justice Kennedy writing the majority opinion, required all states to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples and recognize same-sex marriages from other states. The shift in public opinion had been remarkably rapid in 2000. No state recognized same-sex marriage. By 2015, it was a constitutional right. Kennedy's opinions spoke of dignity, autonomy, and the fundamental right to marry. The dissents warned of judicial overreach and democratic process being short-circuited. The decision transformed American culture overnight. Same-sex couples could marry anywhere, enjoy federal benefits, and have their relationships legally recognized. Pride celebrations that June were jubilant. The White House was lit in rainbow colors. The speed of change from widespread prohibition to constitutional protection in 15 years was historically unprecedented for civil rights expansion. Sometimes cultural attitudes shift faster than institutions, and courts catch up to public opinion rather than leading it. Though international climate agreements would prove more fragile and dependent on political shifts. Paris Agreement entry. November 4, 2016 brought U.S. entry into the Paris Agreement, the international climate accord where nations pledged to limit global warming. The agreement, negotiated in 2015, committed countries to keep temperature increases below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Obama's administration worked hard to structure it as an executive agreement rather than a treaty, knowing the Senate would never ratify anything requiring emission reductions. The U.S. pledged to reduce emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. Then Trump won election days after entry took effect and announced withdrawal in 2017, though the process took until November 2020 to complete. Biden rejoined on his first day in office, January 2021. The enter-exit re-enter cycle highlighted American climate policy's volatility and how executive agreements, while faster than treaties, create instability when administrations change. Other nations watched America's commitment waver with each election, making long-term international cooperation difficult. Sometimes speed and flexibility come at the cost of reliability and trust. Though criminal justice reform would prove one area where bipartisan consensus could still produce legislation. First Step Act. December 21, 2018 brought the First Step Act, a bipartisan criminal justice reform signed by Trump after years of advocacy from both left and right. The law reduced mandatory minimum sentences for some drug offenses, made the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 retroactive, allowing prisoners sentenced under old, harsher crack cocaine laws to seek reduced sentences, and expanded early release programs. It improved prison conditions, banned shackling of pregnant inmates, and provided more rehabilitation programs. The act represented a rare moment of bipartisan agreement that mass incarceration had gone too far and needed reform. It wasn't comprehensive, it only affected federal prisoners, about 10% of the incarcerated population, but it freed thousands and reduced sentences for thousands more. The coalition supporting it included criminal justice advocates, evangelical Christians, and conservative groups concerned about government overreach. The act proved that criminal justice reform could pass when framed around rehabilitation and second chances rather than purely as civil rights legislation. Sometimes progress requires building unexpected coalitions around shared values. Though the pandemic would soon require even more dramatic federal intervention. CARES Act. March 27, 2020 brought the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, pumping over $2 trillion into the economy during the early pandemic. Congress passed it 96-0 in the Senate. The act included direct checks of $1,200 to most Americans, expanded unemployment benefits adding $600 weekly, created the Paycheck Protection Program for businesses, and provided funding for healthcare, schools, and state governments. The direct payments were particularly notable. The government just mailed checks to people, no strings attached. It redefined crisis response, proving that direct cash assistance was possible and politically popular. The PPP was more controversial, with reports of fraud and large companies taking loans meant for small businesses. But the overall package kept the economy from total collapse during lockdowns. Sometimes emergencies break through ideological objections to government spending and reveal what's actually possible. Though the next administration would expand these emergency measures even further. American Rescue Plan. March 11, 2021 brought the American Rescue Plan. Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID relief package passed on party line votes. The plan expanded the child tax credit to $3,600 per child, under 6 and $3,000 per older child, paid monthly rather than as a tax refund. This seemingly technical change cut child poverty by nearly 50% in months. The expanded credit reached 40 million children. Suddenly, families had predictable monthly payments, helping with groceries, rent, and childcare. The plan also included stimulus checks, extended unemployment benefits, rental assistance, and vaccine funding. The child tax credit expansion was temporary, expiring after 2021 when Congress didn't extend it. Child poverty immediately jumped back up. The brief experiment proved that direct cash assistance to families dramatically reduces child poverty. Not surprisingly, giving poor families money makes them less poor. The temporary success and quick reversal showed both the power of simple cash transfers and the difficulty of making such programs permanent. Sometimes we prove solutions work and then choose not to implement them anyway, though infrastructure investment would prove more durable as policy. Infrastructure Investment Act. November 15, 2021 brought the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, a $1 trillion package actually focused on traditional infrastructure: roads, bridges, broadband, water systems. It passed with bipartisan support, 19 Senate Republicans voting yes, proof that infrastructure could still generate consensus. The act funded repair of 45,000 bridges, improvement of thousands of miles of roads, expansion of broadband to rural areas, replacement of lead pipes, and upgrading of the electric grid. It was the largest infrastructure investment since Eisenhower's interstate highway system. The funding would roll out over years, not immediately visible but addressing decades of deferred maintenance. The bipartisan process required compromise. Progressive priorities like climate provisions got reduced, but produced actual legislation rather than partisan statements. The act represented traditional governing, unglamorous negotiation, producing incremental improvement. Infrastructure doesn't generate passionate advocacy, but crumbling bridges affect everyone regardless of politics. Sometimes the boring stuff that passes is more consequential than the exciting stuff that fails. Though marriage equality protections would require more urgent legislative action given judicial uncertainty, Respect for Marriage Act, December 13, 2022, brought the Respect for Marriage Act, repealing the Defense of Marriage Act and requiring federal recognition of same-sex marriages. The law passed in response to the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade in June, which raised fears that Obergefell legalizing same-sex marriage might also be reversed. Justice Thomas's concurrence in Dobbs explicitly suggested reconsidering other substantive due process cases, including Obergefell. Congress acted preemptively, codifying same-sex marriage protections in statute rather than leaving them vulnerable to judicial reversal. The bill got 12 Republican Senate votes and 39 Republican House votes, showing some bipartisan support despite conservative opposition. The act protects existing marriages even if states ban future same-sex marriages, though it doesn't require states to issue new licenses. It's a partial protection, a hedge against worst-case scenarios. The law represents defensive legislating, protecting rights that seem settled but suddenly felt precarious. Sometimes progress requires building statutory backup systems for constitutional protections. Though semiconductor production would require industrial policy, responding to international competition, CHIPS Act. August 9, 2022 brought the CHIPS and Science Act, providing $52 billion in subsidies for domestic semiconductor manufacturing. The act responded to pandemic supply chain disruptions that revealed American dependence on foreign chip production, particularly from Taiwan and China. Over 90% of advanced chips came from overseas, a strategic vulnerability given semiconductor importance in everything from phones to weapons systems. The act incentivized companies to build fabrication plants fabs in the U.S., with Intel, TSMC, and others announcing new facilities. It represented industrial policy making a comeback after decades of market-oriented approaches opposing government-picking winners. The bipartisan support reflected genuine strategic concerns about Chinese competition and Taiwan invasion risks. Chips became recognized as critical infrastructure requiring domestic production capacity. The act marked a shift toward government actively shaping industrial development rather than trusting markets alone. Whether the subsidies successfully rebuild American semiconductor leadership remains to be seen. Fabs take years to build and longer to become productive. Sometimes national security requires paying premiums for domestic production. Though climate and healthcare policy would combine in significant legislation, Inflation Reduction Act, August 16, 2022, brought the Inflation Reduction Act, which, despite its name, was primarily a climate and healthcare bill. The act capped insulin costs at $35 monthly for Medicare recipients, a massive reduction from hundreds of dollars many had been paying. It allowed Medicare to negotiate drug prices for the first time, breaking pharmaceutical company monopoly pricing power. The act extended Affordable Care Act subsidies, preventing premium increases. On climate, it provided $370 billion in tax credits and subsidies for clean energy, the largest climate investment in U.S. history. The act passed through budget reconciliation with only Democratic votes after a marathon negotiation with Joe Manchin, who demanded deficit reduction and fossil fuel provisions in exchange for climate spending. The name was strategic polling showed inflation as a top concern, so Democratic leaders branded climate investment as inflation reduction. Whether it actually reduced inflation is debatable, but it definitely advanced clean energy transition and made healthcare more affordable. Sometimes, successful legislation requires creative naming and strategic framing, though veterans' healthcare would also see long overdue expansion of benefits. PACT Act, August 10, 2022, brought the promise to address Comprehensive Toxics Act, expanding healthcare and benefits for veterans exposed to burn pits and toxic substances. For decades, the VA denied the connection between burn pit exposure in Iraq and Afghanistan, and respiratory illnesses, cancers, and other conditions affecting veterans. Burn pits, massive open-air fires used to dispose of waste, including chemicals, medical waste, and munitions, created toxic smoke that service members breathed constantly. The PACT Act established a presumption of service connection for 23 conditions related to burn pit exposure, finally requiring the VA to cover treatment and provide disability benefits. It also extended benefits for Vietnam veterans exposed to Agent Orange and post-9/11 veterans exposed to other toxins. The act represents the largest expansion of veterans' benefits in decades, with a projected cost of over $280 billion over 10 years. Jon Stewart notably advocated for the bill after it initially failed. Sometimes recognizing service-related injuries takes decades of advocacy and undeniable evidence of harm, though protecting democratic processes would also require legislative attention after January 6. Electoral Count Reform Act, December 29, 2022, brought the Electoral Count Reform Act, clarifying procedures for counting electoral votes, after January 6 revealed vulnerabilities in the 1887 Electoral Count Act. The original law was vague about the vice president's role, leading to claims that Pence could unilaterally reject electoral votes. The reform explicitly states the VP's role is ministerial. They count votes but can't reject them. It raises the threshold for congressional objections to electoral votes, requiring 1/5 of each chamber rather than just one member from each. It clarifies grounds for objections and limits debate time. The act protects state certifications of results and provides judicial review paths for disputes. It passed with bipartisan support, Republicans joining Democrats to prevent future election subversion attempts. The reform acknowledged that constitutional norms backed by ambiguous statute proved insufficient when actors chose to ignore them. Sometimes, democracy requires writing down what everyone thought was understood implicitly, though emerging technology threats would demand attention beyond elections. TikTok ban threat hearings. March 23, 2023, brought House hearings where TikTok CEO Shou Zi-Chew faced 5 hours of hostile questioning about data privacy, Chinese government access, and algorithmic manipulation. The hearings reflected growing bipartisan concern about TikTok's Chinese ownership through ByteDance, potentially allowing Beijing access to Americans' personal data and ability to shape content viewed by millions, especially young users. Montana passed a complete TikTok ban in May 2023, though courts blocked implementation. Other states restricted TikTok on government devices. Congress considered various federal ban proposals. The hearings highlighted data privacy concerns extending beyond TikTok to all social media platforms, but TikTok's Chinese connections made it the primary target. The scrutiny sparked state-level restrictions and forced conversations about data protection Americans lack compared to Europeans under GDPR. Whether federal action ultimately bans or restricts TikTok remains uncertain, but the hearings transformed it from popular app to national security threat in political discourse. Sometimes technology moves faster than regulation, and catch-up attempts get tangled in geopolitics. Though fiscal crises would create their own political dramas, debt ceiling deal. June 3, 2023 brought a debt ceiling deal averting default after months of brinkmanship. The debt ceiling, a legal limit on government borrowing required raising to allow paying existing obligations. Republicans demanded spending cuts in exchange for raising the limit, threatening to force default if demands weren't met. The resulting deal suspended the debt ceiling through January 2025 and limited spending growth. It also included work requirements for some safety net programs and clawed back unspent COVID funds. Critically, it cut IRS funding by $20 billion, reducing the agency's ability to audit wealthy taxpayers and collect owed taxes. The deal passed with votes from both parties, but progressives criticized it as hostage-taking rewarding extortion. The IRS cuts particularly frustrated those who'd celebrated recent funding increases meant to close the tax gap between what's owed and collected. The deal proved that even routine governance, like paying existing bills, becomes leverage points in partisan conflict. Sometimes, avoiding disaster requires accepting policies you oppose, though government transparency on unusual topics would take unexpected legislative turns. UAP Disclosure Amendment, July 26, 2023 brought the UAP Disclosure Act, an amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill, requiring government disclosure of information about unidentified anomalous phenomena, the new term for UFOs. The amendment, sponsored by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Senator Mike Rounds, mandated that government agencies provide records about UAPs to a review board, which would determine what could be disclosed to the public. It created a presumption of disclosure with national security exemptions. The amendment followed Pentagon reports acknowledging numerous military encounters with unexplained aerial phenomena and hearings where military personnel testified about objects performing maneuvers exceeding known technology. The provision represented remarkable bipartisan seriousness about a topic previously dismissed as fringe conspiracy theory. Whether it leads to significant revelations or just bureaucratic compliance remains to be seen. The cultural shift from mockery to congressional action on UFOs reflects either genuine mystery, deserving investigation, or successful lobbying by UFO enthusiasts, depending on your perspective. Sometimes, legitimacy comes from enough people taking something seriously, regardless of underlying reality. Though artificial intelligence would demand more immediate regulatory attention, AI Executive Order, October 30, 2023, brought Biden's executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy artificial intelligence, the most comprehensive federal AI regulation attempt. The order required AI developers to share safety test results with the government before public release for powerful AI systems. It established standards for AI safety and security, directed agencies to address AI discrimination and bias, and protected privacy from AI-enabled surveillance. It created requirements for watermarking AI-generated content to combat deepfakes and misinformation. The order didn't have force of law. Executive orders can't create regulations with the power of legislation, but it directed federal agencies to use existing authorities to implement AI oversight. Tech companies had mixed reactions, some welcoming clarity, while others warned against stifling innovation. The order represented government attempting to regulate rapidly advancing technology. It barely understood, trying to balance innovation against potential harms. The challenge is that AI capabilities are advancing faster than regulatory frameworks can adapt. Sometimes acting on incomplete information beats waiting for perfect understanding that may never arrive. Though the opioid crisis would continue demanding policy responses as well. Fentanyl crackdown bills. 2024 brought multiple congressional bills targeting fentanyl, including measures to increase penalties for trafficking, crack down on precursor chemicals from China, and enhance border screening technology. Fentanyl overdoses had become the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45. Over 100,000 drug overdose deaths annually, most involving synthetic opioids. The crisis created rare bipartisan urgency around drug policy. Bills focused on supply reduction, intercepting fentanyl at borders, and punishing traffickers rather than demand reduction through treatment and harm reduction. Critics argued this repeated failed war on drugs approaches, but political pressure to do something drove punitive measures. Some bills passed with overwhelming support, others stalled in committee. The legislative response reflected public desperation for solutions, while largely avoiding evidence-based approaches like safe injection sites, drug checking services, or decriminalization. Fentanyl's deadliness, 50 times more potent than heroin, made traditional harm reduction arguments harder politically, even as they became more necessary medically. Sometimes crisis demands action, even when effective action remains politically impossible. Though protecting children online would also generate bipartisan concern. Social media child protection laws. 2024 brought a wave of state laws requiring parental consent for minors to use social media, restricting data collection from children, and mandating age verification. Utah, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas passed versions requiring parental approval for accounts under 16 or 18. The laws responded to growing evidence of social media's harm to teen mental health. Increased depression, anxiety, and suicide rates correlated with heavy social media use. The bills drew support from parents worried about their children's online exposure, but concern from civil liberties groups about privacy implications of age verification and First Amendment issues of restricting access to information. Tech companies challenged several laws in court, arguing they were unconstitutionally vague and technologically unworkable. Congress considered federal legislation, but partisan disagreements prevented passage, leaving states to experiment with different approaches. The state-by-state variation created compliance nightmares for platforms. Whether laws actually protect children or just create verification burdens and privacy risks remains contested. Sometimes the impulse to protect leads to policies whose effectiveness and trade-offs are unclear. Though emerging technology competitions would also drive significant federal investment, quantum computing investment. 2024 brought expanded federal investment in quantum computing research as part of strategic competition with China. The National Quantum Initiative, originally passed in 2018, received additional funding and renewed focus. Quantum computers promise revolutionary capabilities breaking current encryption, simulating molecular interactions for drug development, optimizing complex systems, but remain largely theoretical in practical application. The technology requires maintaining quantum states at near absolute zero temperatures, limiting commercial viability. But China's investments in quantum technology created strategic pressure on the U.S. to maintain leadership. Federal funding went to university research centers, national labs, and public-private partnerships. The investment represented a bet on future capabilities rather than current applications, similar to early computing research in the 40s and 50s. Whether quantum computing delivers on its promises or remains perpetually 5 years away from practicality is genuinely unknown. But the fear of falling behind China in emerging technology drove spending regardless of certainty about results. Sometimes strategic competition requires investing in possibilities rather than proven capabilities, though student debt relief would take a more immediate and targeted approach. Student debt forgiveness rounds. 2024 brought multiple rounds of targeted student debt cancellation after the Supreme Court struck down Biden's broad forgiveness plan in June 2023. The administration instead used existing authorities under income-driven repayment plans, borrower defense to repayment for defrauded students, and public service loan forgiveness. By mid-2024, the administration had canceled over $150 billion in debt for approximately 4 million borrowers through these targeted programs. The approach forgave less debt than the original plan's $430 billion, but survived legal challenges by using established statutory authorities rather than emergency powers. Each round of forgiveness was smaller and more targeted: teachers, public servants, borrowers defrauded by for-profit colleges, those with disabilities. The piecemeal approach frustrated advocates wanting broader relief but proved more legally durable. It demonstrated how executive branch can still achieve policy goals after judicial setbacks by using narrower authorities and targeting specific eligible groups. Sometimes, losing the big battle means winning smaller battles repeatedly. Though immigration policy would continue evolving through both compromise and technology. Border security funding compromise. Early 2025 brought a border security funding compromise, shifting focus from physical wall construction to technology and personnel. The package funded surveillance technology, including cameras, sensors, and drones, increased Border Patrol staffing, improved port of entry infrastructure, and expanded immigration judge hiring to reduce asylum case backlogs. The approach represented a shift from Trump-era wall emphasis toward comprehensive border management. The compromise attracted moderate Republican support by addressing security while getting Democratic votes through asylum processing improvements and avoiding purely punitive measures. The package acknowledged that immigration control requires multiple approaches: technology, personnel, legal processing capacity, rather than just physical barriers. Whether it effectively manages border crossings depends partly on implementation and partly on push factors in origin countries beyond U.S. control. The compromise showed that immigration policy could still generate bipartisan legislation when focused on operational capacity rather than messaging priorities. Sometimes moving past symbolic policies toward practical management enables deals. Though advancing scientific research capabilities would also require new infrastructure approaches. National AI Research Resource Launch. 2025 brought the launch of the National AI Research Resource, a program providing researchers nationwide with access to computational resources, data, and tools for AI research. The initiative addressed the concentration of AI capability in a few wealthy tech companies by democratizing access to the supercomputing power AI research requires. Universities and independent researchers typically lack resources to train large models or conduct cutting-edge AI research. The NAIR creates shared infrastructure similar to how particle accelerators or space telescopes serve the broader scientific community. The public-private model combines government funding with industry contributions of computing time and technical expertise. The goal is preventing AI advancement from being exclusively corporate-controlled and maintaining academic independence in AI research. Whether it successfully levels the playing field or merely creates additional research capacity while companies maintain their lead remains to be determined. The initiative represents recognition that AI research infrastructure requires collective investment beyond what individual institutions can afford. Sometimes ensuring broad participation in technological development requires building shared resources. Though veterans' health would continue requiring expanded recognition of service-related conditions, Veterans Burn Pit Registry expansion. 2025 brought expansion of the Veterans Burn Pit Registry to include Gulf War exposures from 1990 and 1991. The registry, originally created in 2014, tracked post-9/11 veterans exposed to burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan. The expansion finally acknowledged that Gulf War veterans had similar toxic exposures, oil well fires, chemical weapons demolition, pesticides, and other environmental hazards. For over 30 years, Gulf War illness affected veterans with chronic fatigue, pain, respiratory problems, and cognitive issues. But the VA resisted connecting symptoms to service. The registry expansion, following the PACT Act's success, represented decades-late recognition. Veterans could now document exposures and access presumptive benefits. The delay cost lives. Many affected veterans died before receiving recognition or care. The expansion showed how slowly bureaucratic systems acknowledge service-related harm, even with overwhelming evidence. Sometimes justice delayed truly is justice denied, though eventual recognition matters for survivors. And speaking of long overdue recognition of systemic gaps, women's health research funding. 2025 brought a significant surge in NIH funding specifically for women's health research, addressing historic data gaps. For decades, medical research disproportionately studied men, then applied findings to women, despite physiological differences. Women were excluded from clinical trials until 1993 guidelines changed and even after, remained underrepresented. Conditions primarily affecting women like endometriosis received minimal research funding. Heart disease research focused on male symptom presentation, causing misdiagnosis in women. The funding increase prioritized research on women-specific conditions, sex differences in disease presentation and treatment response, and inclusion of women across age ranges in studies. The shift acknowledged that half the population had been essentially neglected in medical research, leading to poorer health outcomes. Whether funding translates to meaningful improvement in women's health depends on sustained commitment beyond initial investment. Sometimes recognizing a problem is easy. Fixing it requires years of dedicated resources. Though rural connectivity would address different kinds of systemic inequity, rural broadband expansion completion. 2025 marked a milestone in rural broadband expansion, connecting 10 million previously unserved Americans. The Infrastructure Investment Act funding finally addressed the digital divide, leaving rural areas without reliable internet access. During COVID, the connectivity gap became undeniable. Rural students couldn't attend virtual school. Telehealth was impossible. Remote work was fantasy. The expansion laid fiber optic cables, installed wireless infrastructure, and subsidized connection costs for low-income households. The investment recognized that internet access had become essential infrastructure, like electricity and roads, not a luxury. Rural communities gained economic opportunities previously limited to urban areas. The completion took years and billions of dollars but fundamentally changed rural American life. Whether it stemmed rural population decline or merely made staying more tolerable remains to be seen. The digital divide wasn't just about technology, it was about economic opportunity, education, access, and healthcare availability. Sometimes infrastructure investments are about equity as much as efficiency. Though mental health access would require addressing insurance coverage gaps, mental health parity enforcement, 2025 brought new federal rules enforcing mental health parity laws, fining insurers for violating equal coverage requirements. The Mental Health Parity Act of 1996 and its 2008 expansion required insurers to cover mental health care equally with physical health care. In practice, insurers found countless ways around parity, limiting provider networks, requiring more prior authorizations, denying claims at higher rates. Patients faced barriers to mental health care that didn't exist for physical conditions. The new enforcement rules required insurers to prove comparable treatment or face significant fines. Regulators finally had teeth after decades of unenforced mandates. The rules forced transparency in coverage decisions and leveled access to mental health treatment. Whether enforcement remains consistent across administrations or becomes another cyclical priority depends on political will. The gap between legislated rights and experienced reality had persisted for nearly 30 years before meaningful enforcement arrived. Sometimes laws only become real when someone actually enforces them. Though election security would require its own sustained attention and investment, election security grants. 2025 brought renewed election security grants fortifying voting systems after 2020 exposed vulnerabilities. The grants funded replacing outdated voting machines, implementing paper ballot backups for electronic systems, strengthening cybersecurity protections, and training election officials on security protocols. The election infrastructure hardening happened quietly, no dramatic announcements, just steady improvement of systems. States upgraded voter registration databases, improved physical security at polling locations, and established backup systems for failures. The investment responded to both genuine security concerns and political pressures from claims of election fraud, regardless of evidence. Ironically, improving security helped regardless of whether previous threats were real or imagined. The grants represented bipartisan recognition that election infrastructure needed investment, even if parties disagreed on threat sources. Secure elections benefit everyone regardless of political outcomes. The work was technical, unglamorous, and essential, exactly the kind of governance that rarely gets attention, but fundamentally matters. Sometimes the most important protections are invisible to those they protect. Though environmental programs would create more visible public engagement, Climate Corps launch. 2025 brought the American Climate Corps launch, employing 20,000 young people in conservation and climate-related work. The program, created through executive action, echoed FDR's Civilian Conservation Corps, putting people to work on environmental projects. Corps members installed solar panels, restored wetlands, fought wildfires, weatherized homes, and maintained public lands. They received training, job experience, and pathways to careers in green energy and conservation. The program addressed both climate change and youth unemployment while creating infrastructure for clean energy transition. It proved government jobs programs could serve multiple purposes simultaneously: economic opportunity, environmental protection, and skills development. Critics questioned the executive authority used to create it without legislation and its vulnerability to cancellation by future administrations. The Climate Corps represented how presidential initiative could create programs Congress wouldn't pass, though with uncertain longevity. Sometimes urgent problems require action without waiting for legislative consensus. Though military organizational structures would also evolve to meet modern needs. Space Force civilian integration. 2025 brought Space Force's integration of civilian personnel into previously military-only roles, blurring military-commercial boundaries. The newest military branch, created in 2019, increasingly relied on private sector space capabilities, SpaceX launches, commercial satellites, private space stations. The integration reflected how space operations depend on commercial infrastructure more than traditional military self-sufficiency. Civilian experts brought technical skills military personnel lacked, But the mixing raised questions about civilian control of military operations and private contractor influence over defense decisions. The Space Force became less purely military than other branches, more a public-private partnership managing space domain awareness and defense. Whether this model proves effective or problematic depends partly on how clearly lines between commercial and military interests are maintained. The integration showed how emerging domains force traditional organizational structures to adapt. Space is different from land, sea, or air warfare. It requires different organizational approaches. Sometimes new challenges require abandoning old institutional patterns. Though addressing past pharmaceutical industry harms would require massive financial settlements. Opioid settlement funds distribution. 2025 marked the beginning of opioid settlement funds distribution to communities, with $50 billion from pharmaceutical companies, distributors, and pharmacy chains flowing to state and local governments. The settlements resulted from years of litigation over companies' roles in creating the opioid crisis through aggressive marketing, downplaying addiction risks, and flooding communities with prescription painkillers. The money funded addiction treatment, prevention programs, naloxone distribution, and recovery support services. Distribution formulas considered deaths, addiction rates, and costs each community bore. Some communities invested wisely in evidence-based treatment. Others wasted funds on ineffective programs or used them for unrelated budget needs. The settlements couldn't undo decades of addiction, death, and shattered families, but they provided resources for addressing ongoing crisis. Whether $50 billion proves sufficient depends on how effectively it's spent and how quickly the crisis continues evolving with new synthetic drugs. Sometimes accountability comes through financial settlements rather than criminal prosecution. Though money never fully compensates harm, though cultural preservation would take a different approach to rectifying historical losses. Native language revitalization grants. 2025 brought federal grants, saving 20 endangered Native American languages from extinction. Funding supported immersion schools, elder youth mentorship programs, digital dictionaries, and documentation projects. Many native languages have fewer than 100 fluent speakers, mostly elderly. When languages die, thousands of years of cultural knowledge, oral history, and unique ways of understanding the world disappear permanently. The grants acknowledge that the federal government's historical suppression of native languages through boarding schools, where children were punished for speaking their languages, created this crisis. Language revitalization represented small atonement for deliberate cultural destruction. Programs showed success, some languages gained new young speakers, communities rebuilt linguistic connections to heritage. But the work requires sustained, long-term commitment beyond single-year grants. Languages take generations to kill and generations to revive. Whether federal commitment lasts beyond initial enthusiasm remains uncertain. Sometimes preservation requires acknowledging and addressing past intentional destruction, though technological breakthroughs would point toward future capabilities requiring new protections. Quantum Internet Prototype Demo. 2025 brought a successful quantum internet prototype demonstration at national laboratories, promising unhackable communications. Quantum networks use entangled photons to transmit information. Any interception destroys the quantum state, immediately revealing eavesdropping. The technology could make government communications, financial transactions, and sensitive data truly secure against interception. The demonstration connected multiple lab sites, proving the concept works beyond theoretical physics. But practical quantum internet requires tremendous infrastructure, specialized fiber optic cables, extremely sensitive detectors, quantum repeaters extending range. The technology remains years from commercial deployment, existing mainly in laboratory settings. The demonstration mattered more for proving possibility than immediate application. If successful at scale, quantum internet would fundamentally transform cybersecurity, making current encryption debates obsolete. But between laboratory success and practical deployment lies massive investment and technical challenges. Sometimes breakthrough demonstrations reveal what's possible while highlighting how far practical implementation remains. Though voting rights would continue requiring legislative attention despite technological advances, Voting Rights Advancement Act attempts. 2025 brought renewed attempts to pass the Voting Rights Advancement Act, restoring preclearance requirements struck down by Shelby County v. Holder in 2013. The bill would require states with histories of voting discrimination to get federal approval before changing voting laws. After Shelby, many states immediately implemented voting restrictions, strict ID requirements, reduced early voting, polling place closures in minority areas. The legislation aimed to restore protections, but the bill faced Senate filibuster obstacles, requiring 60 votes it couldn't achieve. Supporters argued voting rights shouldn't require supermajorities. Opponents claimed federal oversight violated state sovereignty. The ongoing fight revealed how difficult restoring once established rights becomes after courts remove protections. What had been settled law for decades became perpetually contested policy. The attempts continued despite repeated failures, advocates refusing to accept that voting protections depend solely on judicial interpretation. Sometimes legislative fights matter even when losing, maintaining pressure for eventual change. Though labor classification would affect millions of workers in emerging economic sectors, gig worker classification guidelines 2025 brought federal guidelines clarifying when gig workers should be classified as employees versus independent contractors. Companies like Uber, DoorDash, and Instacart had treated drivers as contractors, avoiding minimum wage, benefits, and labor protections. The guidelines considered factors like control over work conditions, permanence of relationship, and integral role in business. They pushed many gig workers toward employee status, requiring companies to provide benefits and protections. Companies claimed this would destroy flexible work models. Workers argued they deserved basic protections. The guidelines created legal clarity after years of confusion and misclassification lawsuits. They affected millions of workers in app-based services, delivery, and freelance platforms. Whether states and courts enforce the guidelines or companies find workarounds remains to be seen. The classification battle reflects broader questions about how labor law adapts to technology-enabled work arrangements. Sometimes 21st century work requires updating 20th century legal frameworks. Though artificial intelligence would demand its own regulatory frameworks addressing misinformation. Deepfake regulation 2025 brought federal legislation requiring digital watermarks on AI-generated content, attempting to combat deepfakes in elections and public discourse. The law mandated that AI systems creating synthetic media embed detectable markers identifying content as artificial. Penalties applied to creators and distributors of unmarked synthetic content used to deceive. The legislation responded to growing concerns about AI-generated fake videos, audio recordings, and images becoming indistinguishable from reality. Elections faced threats from fake candidate videos, synthetic audio of politicians saying things they never said, and manipulated images creating false narratives. The watermarking requirement aimed to preserve trust in digital media, but implementation challenges abounded. Watermarks could potentially be removed. Detection required widespread adoption of checking tools, and enforcement against foreign actors was difficult. The law represented government attempting to regulate technology developing faster than policy. Whether technical solutions can preserve digital authenticity or deepfakes simply become normalized as inevitable remains unknown. Sometimes regulation chases technology without catching it, though environmental protection would take a different form addressing extraction industries. Arctic drilling moratorium extension 2025 brought extension of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge drilling moratorium, preserving wildlife habitat over resource extraction. The Arctic Refuge in Alaska contains oil reserves and pristine wilderness, supporting caribou, polar bears, and migratory birds. The moratorium continued decades of back and forth between conservation and drilling interests. Environmental groups celebrated protection of irreplaceable ecosystems. Alaska politicians and resource advocates argued about economic opportunities and energy independence. The extension represented climate diplomacy priorities, protecting carbon sinks, preserving biodiversity, demonstrating climate commitment internationally. But moratoriums reversed by future administrations offer only temporary protection. Permanent preservation requires legislation, which remains elusive given political divisions. The Arctic Refuge has become symbolic, representing broader conflicts between resource extraction and environmental protection, economic development and conservation, present needs and future sustainability. The moratorium extension showed environmental protection's fragility, dependent on executive discretion rather than settled policy. Though education policy would address workforce challenges beyond environmental sectors, teacher shortage loan forgiveness. 2025 brought expansion of teacher loan forgiveness programs, recruiting 100,000 educators into understaffed schools. The enhanced program forgave up to $17,500 in loans for teachers working 5 years in high-need schools or subject areas. The expansion responded to critical teacher shortages, especially in math, science, and special education, worsened by pandemic burnout. Many teachers left the profession entirely. Enrollment in education programs dropped, and schools desperately needed qualified educators. The loan forgiveness made teaching financially viable for those otherwise deterred by education debt. The program targeted high-need schools serving low-income communities most affected by shortages. Whether it successfully addresses shortages depends on retention beyond the forgiveness period and fixing underlying problems, making teaching unsustainable, low pay, poor conditions, lack of autonomy. Loan forgiveness treats symptoms rather than causes, but sometimes symptomatic relief, while addressing root causes, proves necessary. The program showed recognition that education workforce requires investment and incentives. Though, civic engagement would also require renewed emphasis on national service. National Service Corps Proposal. 2025 brought revival of national service proposals, echoing AmeriCorps, expanding youth civic engagement opportunities. The proposal offered Americans aged 18 to 25 options to serve in conservation, education, healthcare, or community development for 1 to 2 years. Participants would receive modest living stipends, education awards, and job training. The program aimed to rebuild civic bonds across partisan divisions by bringing diverse young people together in common service. It responded to declining civic participation, increased polarization, and desire for purposeful work among young people. Whether the program attracts participants depends on stipend adequacy and education benefits competing with immediate employment. Previous iterations like AmeriCorps succeeded modestly but never achieved scale proponents envisioned. The proposal required congressional funding unlikely in divided government. But the concept persists across administrations because civic participation appeals across ideological lines. Everyone supports national service, theoretically, even if implementation details generate disagreement. Sometimes reviving old ideas reflects both their enduring appeal and inability to fully succeed. And with that final echo of civic idealism, we close a century's worth of quiet transformations. And that brings us to the present day, where civic service proposals echo programs from nearly a century ago, and every solution feels like something we've tried before with slightly different branding. Here's what strikes me about these 100 moments. None of them felt world-changing when they happened. A law about civil service exams, a telegram intercepted by codebreakers, an executive order nobody expected. But looking back, you can draw straight lines from these quiet decisions to the world we inhabit now. The structure of our debates, the shape of our cities, who gets to vote, what we breathe, how we communicate, all of it traces back to moments most people never learned about. So the next time someone tells you history is just presidents and wars, remember, a ping-pong invitation changed geopolitics, a quilt changed healthcare policy, and somewhere, right now, something quiet is happening that your grandchildren will study while trying to fall asleep. Which of these 100 moments surprised you most? Drop a comment, subscribe for more hidden history, and sleep well knowing that tomorrow's history is being written in ways nobody's noticing yet. Sweet dreams.